Last week, Pastor Kurt started a series called Family Life. And we want to really walk through for the next few weeks kind of a specific way to have that conversation. We want to actually focus our attention on how do we do life together as a family. So not just your immediate nuclear family, but how do we do life that also has influence and positively on your specific family setting. But how do we do this together in such a way that we can have a positive impact, maybe a welcoming impact on the next generation? And we want to actually not be accidental, but super intentional about that conversation. And there's a couple reasons. One reason is because 1 in 2 young people, according to research, are actually walking away from their faith. And that's alarming and that's concerning, and that it meant think about your family, think about your own kids. If you were to just kind of number them off, 1, 2, 1, 2, that's just not something we're comfortable hearing, right? That's pretty alarming. There's another thing that I want to throw out there, though, and it really is that when we think about, like when you look throughout the story, the narrative story, the big story of the Bible, we just see example after example after example of people being intentional about how they connected the dots between God's story and the story of a young person. And it doesn't take long. It wouldn't take long. If you just thought about it for 30 seconds, you might come up with a list longer than me. But when you just think about the intentionality between Moses and Joshua, he brought him with him where he went, right? He intentionally connected the dots between God's story and Joshua's story. When you think about Elijah and Elisha, there was an intentional connecting of the dots. We could just keep going and going. Eli and Samuel. When we look in the New Testament, there's Paul and Timothy. There's Peter and John Mark. There's Jesus and all of his disciples. There's just this intentional connection of saying, how can I, as somebody who's maybe a little bit further down the road, help you as a young person see your story in light of a bigger story? And we want to use their example as kind of a starting point. We want to say, how is it that we as a church can actually do something about this? And so that's really the question. What can we do to make a real difference at home, in your home, and also in our church family? Are there things that we can do to say, 1 in 2 isn't good enough? So how do we then say we're going to be intentional, we're going to be strategic? This conversation needs a lot of prayer. But we're not going to take the approach of, let's see how this plays out. Because that's not a good response to this, right? I don't want to be alarming, but I think we could actually say there's a bit of a crisis on our hands, and not that we have to be reactive, but surely the heart of God, as we see throughout the story of the Bible, is for the next generation. So what does this look like for us? How do we step into this? So last week we started, and Pastor Kurt did a great job of saying, man, there's 6 commitments that we're going to step into as a church. And last week we heard about the first one. We are going to step into unlocking keychain leadership and parenting. And so, man, if I'm not going to review the whole thing, but just really quickly, Kurt said, man, if we entrust the keys to the next generation, if we're willing to hand off something and share ownership, we can see Jesus unlock the potential of a young leader. And we're trying to be super intentional about that as a church. There's a whole lot of more information we could give you and examples of how we're trying to press into that. And I know, as somebody who's been here for a few years, that this is part of the heart of this church, is to say, how are we being intentional with the next generation? How are we unlocking the keys of young leaders? So today we're going to talk about commitment number 2. Commitment number 2 is empathizing with today's young people. Now, some of you might know the story of a young boy named Steve. He was 13. And he showed up at church, and he asked the pastor, hey, pastor, Steve went to church regularly with his family. And he showed up at church at 13, and he said, hey, pastor, God knows everything, right? Yeah. So does God know what finger I'm going to hold up before I actually hold it up? Is he that smart? Yes, of course he is, Steve. So then Steve said, okay, well, and he pulled out, this was after the service was over, Steve pulled out a Life magazine that had a picture of children suffering in starvation in Africa. And he said, so Pastor, does God know that this is happening? Is God aware that this is going on right now? So the pastor, a bit taken back, tried to assure young Steve, well, of course he does, Steve. But see, you might not understand right now, but God knows. Now, would you be satisfied with the pastor? So Steve left. Steve wasn't satisfied with the answer. He didn't feel like he was actually heard or listened to, and he felt like he just kind of got a pat on the head. So Steve Jobs never went and worshiped in a Christian church again. Now, I don't want to get all heavy on this pastor, for goodness sakes. How many times does somebody come with a question and they're just like provoking? But what would be different if the pastor said, you know what, Steve, that is a really good question. You know what I would love to do? I would love to press in. What if you and your dad and I went for breakfast this week and we had a chance to talk about that? Because there was a question behind the question for Steve. There was some suffering and some internal pain that he was walking through. There was some financial issues that his family was walking through. There was some questions about faith and life that he was trying to navigate. And the only thing he could figure out is, does God know about any of it? I've got some real hurt. And where do I go to ask this question? So I want to ask you, if you, just processing for yourself, what are questions that show up for you in your life, in your world? Or maybe, just to take a step further, what are some questions that you might be aware of? If you were to guess, man, young people today, they've got some big questions. What are some of the questions? We're just going to take a few short seconds here. What are some questions that come up for you that you would think, man, this is a question. This is a question that is on the tip of the tongue for a young person today. Anybody want to be bold enough to yell something out? What is a question a young person you think might be asking today? It doesn't have to be as deep as Steve's, but go ahead. Declan.
How is Christianity true with modern science?
Wow, does modern science and Christianity line up? How can Christianity be true with modern science? Good question. By the way, I'm not going to answer all these. That's not where we're going today. That's a good question. It's not that I don't have an answer, but let's go for breakfast, and I would love to have a conversation with you. Any other questions that just like what comes up? What do you think? What are questions that you think young people might be? Where is God in the suffering of this world? How many people, that was like a question, something like that was where you were going? Yeah, that's just a big question, right? Yeah. Yeah. Man, there's world wars going on. Is God aware? Yeah, it's good. What is the point of life? Let's just get right down to the foundation of this conversation, right? Let's go for breakfast, shall we? What is the point? But that's a good question. It's a good question. What is the point? That's good.
Is the Bible really truthful?
That's good too. Is the Bible, is it actually accurate? Can we trust it? That's good. Man, these are good. One more. Okay.
Why church people only live their faith on the weekends?
Ooh, wow. If you didn't hear that, why do church people only live their faith on the weekends? That's a great question. We really need to go for breakfast. That's fantastic. That's even getting applause. That's amazing. That's fantastic. So empathizing for today's young people, we define empathy as feeling with young people, sitting on the curb of a young person's life, celebrating their dreams, and grieving over their despair. When we empathize, we notice and we care. So here's the bottom line where we're going to go today. We notice and care. That's our part. Jesus shapes identity, belonging, and purpose. This is going to make sense in just 1 second. Our part, emphasize with today's young people, take notice and care. Jesus' part, shape their identity, belonging, and purpose. Now, similar to what we just did, is, hey, what are questions young people asked? There's a group called the Fuller Youth Institute, and they said, we're going to dig into this conversation. We're not just going to ask a couple. They asked hundreds of young people, and they said, what is it that your questions actually are? And they wrote a book, and I'm dependent on this book for today's message. If you are a parent, I highly recommend this book. 3 big questions that change teenagers. There's a lot of content we're taking from this book today. Kara and her team have done just amazing work, and we're going to just kind of sit with for a moment. We're going to trust the fact that their information is good, and we're going to use some of the questions they received when they went to young people. They said, hey, what are your questions? And their questions kind of categorized or themed themselves into kind of 3 main areas. And some of them are represented by the questions we asked in the room today. One question is, who am I? There's a question of just identity. Who am I? Right? There's another question, and it's, where do I fit? And that's a question of belonging. And finally, there's a question of, like, can I really make a difference? And there's a lot of young people just walking around asking the question, can I really make a difference? And there's a question of purpose. And so if we take a look at the next slide, we're just going to see these questions kind of overlap, and there's a lot of questions, right? These aren't just, not young people just didn't say, who am I? Check. That wasn't like, but all open-ended, all the questions that they asked, they kind of, you could bring them all into these 3 categories of identity, belonging, and purpose. And so we want to just take a moment today, and we want to ask the question, we desire, and we even say out loud, we want to be a Jesus-centered church, right? What in the world does that look like when we have young people asking these questions? Like, really, honestly, does Jesus have anything to say to these questions? If you were to go for breakfast with a young person and they asked any of the questions that we heard this morning, does Jesus have a response? I think he does. And so we're going to just take a moment today. We're going to talk about all 3 of those, just a lot of content, so we're going to jump right in. So, identity. Let's talk about identity. Identity gets talked about a lot today. Essentially, our identity is simply how we view ourselves. If somebody were to say, can you describe yourself to me? What comes up? When you think about yourself, what do you think of? It's our identity. It's what we think about ourselves. As young people, there's a few things that came to the surface as they were processing this. They thought, I am what others expect. That often is what shapes my identity. Often what shapes my identity is my image and my desire to be more than my label. Let's just dive in for a second. So, I am what others expect. There is a tremendous pressure on young people, and I'm not going to pretend I'm young anymore, okay? But I know this to be true, not just for me thinking back to my days as a younger person, but in seeing the research and hearing stories and talking to young people, I just know that there's a tremendous level of pressure to say, how do I live up to the expectations that are placed on me by all of the different people who I feel the demands of? So even as we think about image or identity, as being what we think of when we think of our true selves, I think a young person today is kind of going, which self are we talking about? Are we talking about how I'm supposed to show up at home, how I'm supposed to show up at school, how I'm supposed to show up at my job, how I'm supposed to show up at church? Because all of those people have different expectations. I want you to just picture for a moment that a young person is on a stage and they're at a local theater. And the theater is filled, the audience is filled with all of the people that they know. And so they're just kind of subdivided into sections. You've got their family over off to the side, their nuclear family, their brothers and sisters, stepbrothers, stepsisters, and then there's extended family connected there. And then right in the middle, you got this big group of friends that are from school, sports teams, their neighborhood, friends that they hang out with. Then you've got over off to the other side, you've got teachers, you've got mentors, you've got coaches, you've got all the people that they interact with in other extracurricular activities. Then you've got right in the front row, you've got this group of people that are on social media, and it's the people that they follow or want to be followed by. And all of these people are showing up. And here's the expectation for a young person is meet everybody's expectations all the time. And that's a tall order. And so there's this pressure that a young person is feeling because it feels like what others expect actually starts to form or shape their identity. I am my image. Now, I think young people throughout the years have always had this desire to put on an image, right? But the way technology has developed, young people literally have the ability to brand or even advertise themselves, and I would suggest have the pressure to do so at times. Like there's this unspoken, or sometimes spoken very loudly, pressure to present yourself to the world in such a way that you're competing now with people who do this for a living or have teams of people who do this for them. And so my image and how it's presented, both on social media and at school, I am my image. That's my identity. It's who I look like, whether or not that's true with who I actually am on the inside. There's this pressure to perform. I am more than my label. More than any time, I would suggest in society, in history, we are quick to throw labels on stuff. We are quick to evaluate and categorize people, right? From learning styles to the state of my mental health to my trauma history. And what happens is we end up getting these labels, and I think a young person is crying out and saying, I am more than my label. My identity goes deeper than that. So now, I want to just ask the question, so what does Jesus have to say? What does Jesus have to say about somebody wrestling through, how do I live up to the expectation? How do I live in such a way that I can move outside of the labels that are put on me? Or I can be at least relieved a little bit from the pressure of needing to advertise or brand myself. What does Jesus say to all of this? I think Jesus says, young person sitting, listening right now in the room or online, you are enough because of Jesus. I wonder if we can just rest in that just for 1 second. You are enough because of Jesus. In a world where there is constant pressure to prove ourselves, what if we rested long enough to realize our identity actually doesn't come from the things we are striving for? Theologian and minister Marva Dawn highlights this sense of being made in God's image calls us all constantly to look for it in others and to do what we can to help them acknowledge it. Man, this is something we have to be all in on. Together, we celebrate and call out the enoughness Jesus offers. This is not something that just young people struggle with. The need to show up and perform for somebody else, man, it is something that is there for all of us. And sometimes we just have to look each other in the eye and say, whoa, stop. Can I be honest? You are enough because of Jesus. It changes who you are when you look in the mirror, because you are made in the image of the God who made the universe and who made you. And that just changes everything. Now, that sounds really quaint, but let's actually dive in a little bit. How do we actually move from this idea of identity and who I am, and then we say, but we're a Jesus-centered church and you're enough? So I just want to give you a quick practice, and I'm going to give you some questions. I'm not going to give you as much time as I would like for you to process these questions, but for parents in the room, you can take a shot on the screen if you want, but here's some questions, and there's 3 sets of questions that I'm going to ask you. One is now, and the question is, or the reason is can we be curious at the state of where we are and at the state of where our young people are right now? Not okay, what happens if everything is ideal? Like right now, how are you doing with your sense of identity? So there's a couple questions. When you ask yourself, who am I? Man, what sorts of words or phrases come up for you? So as we process what it means to be a Jesus-centered church, I'm asking us right now, man, when we think about our identity as people in the room, as a kind of church that says we want to empathize with today's young people and we want to be a place that welcomes them, for us to do a bit of an inventory, what words or phrases come to mind when we think about, man, who am I? How have you felt have you ever felt you had to act a certain way because friends or family wanted you to? This isn't a shaming exercise. This is, I really want to know. What kind of pressures come up for you when you think about your struggling to identify who you are? The next question is the God question, and that's, what does it look like to say, if God spoke into this conversation for you, what comes up? What does God have to say about this conversation? Question number 1, how would you say your faith impacts your view of yourself? Don't tell me what I want to hear. How do you actually believe it? How does your faith actually impact or make a significant change to how you actually view yourself? How do you wish your faith shaped your view of yourself? Again, this is not me telling you the right answer. This is us being able to process it and being able to process it with a group of young people who are trying to sort this out for themselves. Finally, the question is how? How can you walk forward with your identity with Jesus in the center? Is there some practical way that you can step into your identity knowing that Jesus is actually the middle of it? Question number 1, what would you have to do to elevate God's voice above the voices of others who are defining you? There's piles of voices. Is there something that you can do to elevate what God has to say about you? Question number 2, what would you gain by doing so? But let's be curious. What would you lose by doing so? Is there anything that you might lose by that? What comes up for you? Really quickly, there's an example in the Old Testament of this that I think is fantastic, and we're just going to put one verse on the screen because I'd like to just put the entire story of David on the screen, but it wouldn't fit. So 1 Samuel 16:1, the Lord said to Samuel, I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Just as a point of introduction, I would encourage you, if identity is a question that you're asking right now, if this is one of those things where you're like, man, I would like to just sit in this a little bit more, I would encourage you to just read through 1 Samuel, the story of David. As God is always a step ahead, and he always wants to present some form of identity. He wants to allow David to know that he is more than he is what he is willing to provide or do or present to the world around him. Before he accomplished anything, God says, I've got my eye on this kid. And many of you know the story, but Samuel shows up, and it must be the tallest, oldest, the strongest of the children. He goes all the way down to the runt. In fact, he wasn't even there. He was out herding the sheep. And as David walked and looked after sheep, he struggled to identify and to explore his identity with his father. And as he wrestled and protected some sheep, God started to form and shape him, and he knew that he was a part of something bigger. He knew that the story didn't start with him. He was a part of something way bigger. So, again, we're not going to dive into the story much more. Read it. I would encourage you to take some time. The second big question that we're going to wrestle with is, so it's who am I? Where do I fit? There's a sense of belonging, and simply our belonging is our connection with other people. Where do we fit, and how do we belong? I remember my second year of college. Me and my roommate were like 19, maybe 20, and this was a little while ago. Michael W. Smith came out with an album. I don't even remember what the album was called, but there was a song on the album called My Place in This World. As a young person, this one I can resonate with a lot more. As a young person, I remember this, My Place in This World. I'm not going to sing it because you would all run away. But I'm just going to simply read the chorus of this song. It's very deep. I'm looking for a reason, roaming through the night to find my place in this world. My place in this world. As a 20-year-old man, this got me. Not a lot to lean on. I need your light to help me find my place in this world, my place in this world. I think my roommate specifically played that song at least a dozen times a day for 4 months. My place in this world, there's just desire to go like, where in the world do I fit? Do I actually fit anywhere? As young people were surveyed, they said, I fit where I feel safe to be me and where I feel I'm needed. So young people feel they fit where they feel a level of comfort, where they feel they're not being judged, where they feel they don't have to be fake. Young people feel where they feel that they can be authentically who they are. And this is really significant for us. And I think the reason why it's so significant is it astounds me that the reputation of the church is sometimes that we're fake people. And here's what seems weird, is the local church is one of the only organizations on the planet that the prerequisite to belong is that you have to come to terms with the fact that you need something. You need help. You're not enough on your own. You need Jesus. I've sinned. I'm a pastor. Let me just come out with it. I've sinned. If you grilled me, you would find stuff. And we just have to stop pretending. Because this is one of those things that makes young people just run the other way. So church, we have to be vulnerable, we have to be open. We need to provide a space where if a young person makes a mistake, it's not an exercise in shaming. It's a matter of how do we create a space for you to be the authentic version of who God has made you to be. In fact, we're a place to help you figure that out. I fit where I fit where I have to help out in some way, where I feel needed. One of the ways researchers talk about belonging is seeing ourselves as integral parts of the environments that surround us. How are we able to contribute in the relationships, in the organizations, in the structure, in the systems around us? Are we a contributing member of those things? That helps me feel like I belong. So for anybody that serves in any capacity, bring a young person with you. It was a highlight for me. I think it was a couple months ago. We had a bunch of our junior highs serving coffee and hosting people when they were coming through the door. That was one of the best Sundays of the year. It was fantastic. We've got some great young people here. And we just need, how can you be involved in what we as a church do? You are so important here. What happens when we put Jesus at the center of our questions of belonging? Jesus just simply says, young person, this is my message to you. You belong with God's people. God has created us to be in community with God and with others through Jesus. We don't have to earn love, acceptance, or our place in the body of Christ. We belong to God and to one another. We're not alone, we're family. God is with us and our young people, no matter what. This is better news than just feeling safe to be me. Hear this. This is better news than feeling safe to be me. Safety is fleeting, conditional, and subject of how others make us feel. Make no mistake, safety is critical for relational connection. But our truest belonging is not dependent on the success or failures of others to live it out. It has already been decided by the unconditional love of God. Because of Jesus, I belong. It's because of him. It's not because I show up and I have something to offer. Jesus says I belong, so that means you belong. It just does. So we want to be curious. Where is the young person at? So the question is now, when do you feel the most or least comfortable around other people? This is just a good question, again, for us to do some self-reflection. Who are the people in your life who make you feel like you fit, like you belong? That is an amazing question for every parent in the room. Who makes you feel like you belong? What environment makes you feel like your most authentic self? Parents, you have to know the answer to that question. But then when God comes into this, what shows up for us? How do we put Jesus right in the middle? How do you know you belong with God's people? Is that your experience? How do you know? What does our church family do to help you feel like you belong unconditionally? Whew. Too close? What do you wish we did differently? Man, how do we function as a church where young people know they fit here unconditionally? What do? What are the things that we just really don't do a good job of? Let's call that out. Let's have some conversations. And then how do we step into this? How do we actually move in a direction? What do we need from others to really know? What do you need, from others to really know that you belong with them no matter what? Again, that unconditional conversation. What can you do to help others know they belong no matter what? Again, this is an opportunity for us to contribute together. How is it that not only I belong, but how do I help create an environment where other people feel like they belong? A great story of belonging in the Old Testament is the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth's mother-in-law creates this space. She creates a home. She welcomes Ruth in. She's from a different family, a different nation. She's like, hey, no, there's space for you here. It's a story of belonging. Again, if you're processing the conversation about belonging, about where do I fit, I would encourage you to take some time and just read the whole story of Ruth. Simply in verse 116, Ruth has this famous line, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn my back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." There's just this beautiful story of somebody feeling like they found their fit. They didn't belong, but they were made to belong. Third big question is a question of, how do I actually make a difference? Is there something that I can do that makes a difference? There's a sense of purpose. What is our contribution to the world around us? How are we contributing? How are we demonstrating that we've got something to offer? Why am I here? For the young people, there was at least 3 areas that they talked about. They said, I make a difference when I'm helping others, when I get to make choices about my life, and when I'm headed towards a good future. I make a difference when I'm helping others. I make a difference when I'm caring for others, and when someone really is actually dependent on me. Like I've got something to offer. The amazing thing about all the people that we talked about at the beginning that were poured into intentionally by an older leader, what did they do with their life? They then poured in to the next generation, all of them. This as my kids were growing up, Zach, I remember asked us a question a lot. He says, man, for a family or organization that talks about grace, we spend a lot of time focusing on rules. And he was just trying to navigate and process as a teenager all of this. And so we had a chance to go on a missions trip together with Sequest. They had a mission fundraiser here last night. It was great to go and just think back to some of our experiences with Sequest. We're still partners with them. But I will remember for the rest of my life, we had an opportunity to help a family in Progreso, Mexico, and they just had garbage. It cost them money to deliver garbage, so they literally just threw garbage onto their yard. There was garbage piles in their home, there was garbage piles on their yard, there was just garbage everywhere. And I remember we as a team just showed up and we said, it's garbage day. We're picking up garbage. We're gonna collect all the garbage and then we're gonna pay to have it removed from their yard. Dozens and dozens of bags of garbage. But I remember Zach intentionally, he went off by himself. He was in this whole stretch right beside the house and the fence, and he was just filling bags of garbage. And you could just see it in his eyes. He was like, my faith has to hit the ground somewhere so that I can actually practically demonstrate that Jesus means more to me than sitting around having another conversation. I could just see it, and you're just like, this has to be something that defines who we are. Are we called to some kind of purpose? I make a difference when I get to make choices about my life. I make a difference when I feel that I have some kind of agency or power to choose at least some of what happens in my life. There's a releasing, there's an empowering. I make a difference when I'm headed toward a good future for me and others that I care about. Is there an opportunity for me to live my best self? And it's not, I don't want to be selfish, I want to care for others, but I want to do it in a way that I can actually step into how I'm wired, and it gives me an opportunity to do something significant. So then we say, okay, so does Jesus have something to say about the purpose that a young person is striving for? When we place Jesus at the center of our desire to live purposefully, something happens. We are invited into God's greater story. And this is one that is so significant. I think this is where we could just sit here for like a week and a half and talk about this together. Christ-centered purpose comes from knowing we're invited into God's greater story. Our best answer to the question, what difference can I make, is that our lives matter because we're part of an ongoing plot of what God has done, is doing, and will do in our world. We are invited into the activity of God, and he has place for us in his story. And it's powerful. I would suggest it's the best way for a young person to identify, what is it that I'm here for? How do I contribute? Are there ways in which we as parents and we as a people with our eyes on the next generation to say, we want to help you discover and step into the purpose that God has placed you here for? So let's get curious. If we ask our young person, if we reflect personally, if you wrote a book about your life so far, how would you break it up into chapters? What would it look like? Think about your life. What is the story of your life? What words would you use to describe yourself as a character in your story currently? Then we put Jesus right in the middle of that conversation and says, what part does God play in your story? A leading role, a director, or is he an extra? And this is just a question. I think this is a helpful exercise for us to just process. Where does God fit? What role does he have? What part would you like God to play in your story? Why did you choose that role? And is there some practical way? How do we step into that? How do we process this together? So in whose story have you been an important character? What actions can you take to make their story even better? Are there ways that you're engaging in the life of somebody else where you're able to contribute? Is there something you could do to contribute even more? Last question, what would you like to be said about your life by those who know you? As you think about the story of your life, are you building a good story? Are there things that don't fit? What comes to mind? If purpose is one of the things that you're processing, and it's just like, man, I need to sit in this a little bit longer, I would encourage you to read the book of Esther. Mordecai has just this fascinating comment and conversation as Esther is processing who she is and the struggle that her people are facing. And this is where kind of the rubber hits the road. Our people are facing annihilation. And Mordecai says something, and this is brilliant. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. You are connected to God's story, and that's not going to change. Your actions today will not remove you from his story. But you and your father's family will perish. Sorry, but that's going to happen. So what you do matters, but it doesn't remove you from his story. This is profound. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Oh, I think we need parents and I think we need leaders going to our young people and say, hey, guess what? There's a stat that's kind of haunting us right now. 1 in 2 young people are kind of just walking away. What is God saying to you as a young leader here? How's your own faith journey? What's your own identity based in? Do you feel like you fit? But do you feel like you have a role in this story? As we press in as a church, as we talk about what it looks like to be family, do you know that you're part of the family? That without your voice in this conversation, something is lacking? And we need to hear from you, young person. So So ultimately today, as we're processing what it looks like to empathize, we want to empathize with today's young people. We want to notice, and we want to care. We want Jesus to be right in the center of their identity, their belonging, and their purpose. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple thoughts or a couple things, activities even to think about. First, for your home life, a couple things to parents. Practice Sabbath together. How does Sabbath have anything to do with this? What does it look like to just recognize and make Jesus part of your weekly rhythm, that he is actually enough and that we can rest in that? You don't need to earn anything from Jesus, but what does it look like as a family to say, we're gonna practice Sabbath? Don't start with 24 hours. Start with like 2 or 3. Start with half an hour. We just take a moment and we recognize that Jesus is enough. So is there one thing that we want to stop doing? And is there one thing that we want to start doing because it's Sabbath and we want to make Jesus part of our rhythm? Practice hospitality. Invite a friend over. Work together to prepare a meal. This is an opportunity for belonging and purpose to come together. As a family, what does it look like to just say, hey, who's a friend? Let's make a meal. You got to help me, but let's make a meal together. Let's just demonstrate hospitality. And I just love the rhythm of this. And the rhythm of it, I hope was clear, is from this book. Now, God, and how. Let's be curious with our students. Where is this showing up for you? How can I be curious? How can I know? I'm going to stop talking. I want to hear from you. How is this showing up in your world? How can God be right in the middle of it? And then how do we actually step in and live that out in such a way that it's helpful? But spend a lot more time listening than talking. Next, for church life. Can I just encourage all of us? Take time to notice and listen to somebody younger than you. As a church, we are just so much more than the specific age demographic that we're part of. We're stronger when we connect with people from every generation. Create space for young people to hear stories of transformation and authentic life change. This is a game changer. Can we create space? As you have an opportunity to interact with people, is there space and opportunity for stories of life change to just become the regular practice? And again, as a leader, we can practice the now, God, and how. I know we had a lot of content that we walked through. I would like to pray for you and just bless you. And then we're going to have the worship team come up, and we're going to finish by focusing our attention and saying, Jesus, you are in the center of all of this, not a strategy. We invite you to be in the middle of who we are because we want to be a Jesus-centered church. So I just pray a blessing over you. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. God, I thank you that you are good. I thank you that you are for the people in the room. God, if any way this is turned into somebody feeling guilty, I pray that you would erase that, and I pray that you would bring freedom. Help us to repent when it's appropriate. God, I thank you that you are a God who brings freedom. Help us in our own pursuit of identity, belonging, and purpose. God, I thank you that you offer all 3 of those with so much left over. Jesus, we love you, and we want to take some time and worship you now. Amen.